Thank you very much, Martin, and let me extend a warm welcome to our colleagues of the media, thanking them for joining us today for the launch of the World Employment and Social Outlook Trends 2021 report. Colleagues, it's now 15 months since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic. And it's not just been a public health crisis, it's also been an employment and a human crisis as well. And the report that we are launching today analyses the impact of the crisis on labour markets across the world. We offer projections for recovery, and we try to give a sense of what we might expect in the months and years ahead. The report also gives details of the unequal impact of the crisis on different groups of workers and enterprises. And finally, the report offers some policy steps for building a broad-based, human-centered recovery, very much the type of recovery that we believe the world requires. So let me start with the effect on labour markets. For the year 2020, last year, the ILO has calculated that the shortfall in working hours actually worked, was the equivalent of 255 million full-time jobs compared to the last quarter of 2019. And the recurring waves of the pandemic have caused its impact, as we know painfully, to persist into 2021. And our new report compares the amount of working hours lost through the pandemic with the situation if the COVID-19 crisis simply had not happened. And in this scenario, on this basis, we estimate that in the first quarter of this year, 2021, 4.8% of total working hours were lost as a result of the COVID crisis, and that is the equivalent of 140 million full-time jobs. In the second half of 2021, we anticipate significant employment growth. However, this will be uneven and not enough to repair the damage caused by the crisis. And so if we take 2021 as a whole, the average shortfall in working hours is projected to be the equivalent to 100 million full-time jobs. 100 million full-time jobs in 2021. That, by the way, is worse than the estimate that we made in January by the equivalent of 10 million full-time jobs. And that is a result of the resurgence of the pandemic in several regions, and as well the slower than expected rollout of vaccines in many countries. Now, what does this mean for employment itself, the employment figures? And this is where people have not just worked fewer hours, but have lost their jobs entirely. Compared with the hypothetical no pandemic situation, our projection is that this jobs shortfall will be at 75 million in 2021, 75 million in 2021, and 23 million looking ahead in 2022. Overall, we project that unemployment in the world in 2022 will therefore stand at 205 million. And to give you the comparison, in 2019, so before the crisis, that figure stood, global unemployment, at 187 million. So we go from 187 million in 2019 to 205 million in 2022. In addition, we expect the employment situation will be worse in low-income countries. High-income countries will close the gaps the fastest thanks to their better access to vaccines and their strong fiscal policy support. The report also details the way that this crisis is making long-standing labour market inequalities and decent work deficits worse. For many millions of people, the working hour losses, combined with a lack or absence of social protection, have simply meant an increase in poverty. And here again, with a comparison to 2019, an estimated 31 million working people are now classified as extremely poor, living on less than the international poverty line of $1.90 per day, as defined by the United Nations. Let me put it in another way. 5 years of progress in reducing working poverty have been wiped out by this crisis. Colleagues, there's also evidence of a shift away from wage and from salaried work towards self-employment, and this is important. It's important because, in general, self-employment is disproportionately associated with low productivity and informal work, and therefore a sign of deteriorating work quality. Businesses in the informal economy faced additional problems because they were less likely to be able to access official COVID-19 related support or formal lines of credit. And the consequence of all of this is that many businesses, and particularly micro and small enterprises, have had to close, or if not, face a highly uncertain future. And related to this, we see that informal employees were 3 times more likely to lose their jobs than were formal employees. By contrast, at the other end of the scale, if you like, workers and businesses in higher skilled sectors, in places with better internet access, often found it easier to keep going through remote work forms. And this has accentuated the divide between the global north and the global south. The crisis threatens to undermine and even reverse as well progress on gender equality. Experience has shown that women have been more likely than men to lose work, and at the same time saw their unpaid hours of work, care work in particular, increase. And so, without specific action, this will bring back outmoded gender divisions and roles. Many young people have also been affected particularly heavily at a critical point in their lives because of the disruption to their transition from education into work. We know that such disruption can often have a long-lasting effect on both wages and employment prospects. More details of this, and we can expand upon it, are given in an ILO briefing on the youth labour market impact of COVID-19 that we are publishing alongside our main WESO Trends report. Ladies and gentlemen, without a recovery strategy that specifically targets these and other groups, those that have been hardest hit, there is a very real risk that we will end up with inequalities that are worse than they were before the crisis. So long COVID could become an economic and social phenomenon, not just a medical one. The WESO Trends report confirms that to counter this, to stop it happening, we need a human-centered recovery strategy, and we believe that this can be built around and should be built around 4 elements. First, it needs to promote broad-based economic growth and employment creation, and this needs to include supportive macroeconomic policies, help for businesses, particularly in the hardest hit sectors, and greater public and private investment in employment-intensive sectors. Secondly, we must strengthen protections for workers as well as support for household incomes and labour market transitions, and this requires a particular focus on those most affected by the crisis. And it will also be important to strengthen the institutional foundations that underpin economic growth and development to ensure that it is sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. In particular, we must strengthen social protection systems since they play a critical role in giving the most vulnerable people access to healthcare and to income security. And lastly, the 4th point, we need to promote social dialogue between governments and employers and workers organizations. This is essential if we are to develop and implement recovery strategies that are going to mobilize public support and which in practical terms are simply going to work. So colleagues, briefly, these are some of the main messages in our report. I want to thank you for your attention and to let you know that my colleague, the Director of Research at the ILO, Richard Salmons, who is sitting next to me, will be happy to take questions, as indeed our other two colleagues who are with us online. Thank you, Martin. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, DG. Let's move on to the Q&A part now. I ask you to please raise your hands if you have a question, and we'll unmute you. And also, if you can state the name of the media outlet that you represent. So let me see if I see any hands up. Okay, first one is Laurent Siro from the Swiss News Agency. Over to you, Laurent.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, and thank you for that briefing. Director General, you mentioned briefly the long COVID problem. Do we already have an idea of the effect of long COVID, because there were a lot of young people that were facing that as well, on the loss of working hours? And secondly, as we are a few days ahead of the opening of the main segment of the labor conference, what are your expectations? Thank you.
Yeah, let me go to those two questions. You know, I'm using a little bit of license here to try to say, when I make a reference to long COVID, I'm saying that long COVID is not simply a medical condition, which it certainly is, but also runs a risk of being translated into the economic and social sphere, in the sense that one of the worst social pathologies of COVID-19 would be to leave long-lasting effects, deleterious effects on the world of work. And that could apply to individuals. If young people have their start in working life disrupted, and that extends over decades, literally decades ahead, or indeed, if growth and development strategies are disrupted and give rise to ever greater inequalities and inequities in the world of work. So that was the point I was making, but I think you're going to the medical point. And I think we are understanding, it's, by the way, our experience in this organization, that long COVID is a very worrying and quite widely present medical condition, which employers, enterprises are going to have to take due account of. Where working people do suffer long-term health problems, these are going to have to be integrated into the way enterprises and indeed public authorities deal with such situations. Obviously, it's a new phenomenon, so we're going to have to work our way through it. But I think the message from us, I haven't got figures to offer you about prevalence of long COVID in the strictly medical sense. We're going to have to work harder on working out how we deal with people who are so affected. You've made the point, and I thank you for doing so, that the International Labour Conference is now underway. It's formally in session. It's a rather particular conference, firstly because we were unable to have a conference last year, and secondly because it is a almost entirely virtual conference, and that means particular disruption to the way our conference will work. It will extend in its entirety through to December of this year. It won't be meeting permanently in that period, but it is a prolonged session. I think for the purposes of this conversation, there is one area of the conference's work that I would like to underline, and that is the work which is underway to have our conference adopt what I hope will be an important political declaration, an important political message about a global response for a human-centered recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, it's a political response to the technical issues, which are the quantitative and detailed issues that we're setting out in our WESO report. Now, this is subject to intensive negotiation already. You'll understand that when we have representatives of governments, employers and workers of 187 member states contributing to the negotiations, this is a tough, difficult process. but I am fully confident that because of the importance of the issues that we are addressing, and also because I think of a great deal of common understanding in our constituents about its importance for the future, that our conference will come up with a strong political statement on the road ahead. And I very much hope so, because that will help the ILO play its role, as it must, in the recovery process, this broad-based, human-centered recovery.
Okay, let's move on. Let's now go to Nick Cumming-Bruce from the New York Times. Over to you, Bruce. Hi,
Sorry,
Nick.
are you hearing me now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I hear you. Do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. You referenced 205 million people who will be, or 205 million jobs that won't be in existence in 2022. I'm wondering, do you have a sense of where geographically this kind of unemployment and job loss will be felt most acutely? Thank you.
Yeah, let me just have a first go, and then I'll pass over to my colleague Rick Salmons for the detailed response. The figure being referred to by the questioner is global unemployment levels, which, as he's correctly stated, we expect to be at 205 million in 2022. It's a global rate of 5.7%, and it compares to 187 million pre-crisis. So you'll get an idea of what the global unemployment figures look like. For the breakdown of where we think these figures will hit the hardest, if you'll allow me, I'll ask Rick Salmons perhaps to fill in on the details in response to the question.
Okay, thanks, and good morning, colleagues. The Latin America and the Caribbean have been among the hardest hit by the crisis, but it's also been recovering relatively quickly. With the working hour losses falling from 33% to 11%. Nevertheless, that 11% still, it represents the highest figure across all regions. So that's one particular area of the world where you see a disproportionate impact that is likely to persist. At the other end of the spectrum is the Asia Pacific region, which in the first quarter was at 3% net loss in working hours compared to the no pandemic scenario that the Director General described. That's down from 17% in the second quarter. More generically, the outlook is better for countries that are seeing more rapid uptake and distribution deployment of vaccines on the one hand, and a bit more fiscal firepower, fiscal space in support of measures along many of the dimensions that the Director General just related concerning vulnerable or hardest hit groups. So these are the areas of the world where we see the recovery fastest in relative terms, whereas a number of areas of the developing world in particular, lower income countries and lower middle income countries, are still sources of very significant concern.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Let's move on now. Go to Moussa Assi, please.
Oui, merci beaucoup. J'ai deux petites questions, mais en français, s'il vous plaît. La première, vous évoquez dans le rapport les chiffres pour l'année 2021 et 2022. Est-ce que cela aussi vaut pour l'année 2020? Parce que je n'ai pas vu de chiffres pour l'année 2020. Ma deuxième question concernant les pays pauvres. Donc, si l'économie dans les pays développés va reprendre à partir de maintenant ou la deuxième moitié de l'année 2021. En ce qui concerne les pays pauvres, et toujours si on suit cette trajectoire de distribution de vaccins qui est inégale pour le moment, on projette à quelle date ou quelle année l'économie dans les pays pauvres va démarrer. Merci.
Thank you very much. I hope it's okay if I respond in English to the questioner, but I thank him for his questions that he's put. Yeah, look, our report does build from a base in 2020, which we've documented in the past already in great detail. We can certainly provide you with some of the figures around 2020, which which are in the report and indeed, as I've said, have previously been distributed by the ILO. But if there's anything specific that you wish to have referred to or explained, we'll be happy to do that offline. You've raised as well the very, very important issue of the less developed and low-income countries and how they are going to experience recovery from this crisis. And I think one of the key messages of this report, and I want to emphasize it because it's important across several dimensions, it is the unevenness of this process of recovery that we see gathering form. In contrast to what we saw in the case of the financial crisis of a little more than a decade ago, 2008, 2009, for reasons that Rick Sammons has explained, and I've tried as well to explain, that is to say, better access to vaccines, unequal access to vaccines, and unequal, what Rick described as fiscal firepower. It is the developed countries, the high-income countries, which are going to pull out of the current situation more quickly. It is extremely difficult to answer directly your question about when the lower income countries are going to be able to recover in any complete way. Why is it difficult? Because access to vaccines remains problematic and uncertain, because the future trajectory of the pandemic itself remains uncertain, and also because it remains to be seen, as we are strongly advocating, to what extent the international community will respond to the very evident need to support the fiscal space, to support the resources available to low-income countries. And all of that renders, a very precise answer to this important question problematic. But what I do think is important for me to underline is that this unequal recovery risks accentuating still further inequalities in the world of work between countries, is where the questioner is pointing to, and within countries. In other words, an already unequal world is all too likely to come out of this crisis more unequal still. And that is not an acceptable or a secure or safe situation for any country, whatever their access to resources. I don't know, Rick, if you want to expand upon what I've said, but that's my response to the questioner.
I could give a few specific numbers. The first more general point before providing some numbers is that we're dealing with ranges of uncertainty here. We can't predict with precision the future. So what we've tried to do in this report is provide 3 scenarios for how things may unfold, broken down by different categories of countries. Your question went to the poorer countries. So just to give you a couple of quick illustrations, the report lays out a baseline scenario. And as that baseline, it's projected for low-income countries that 13 million jobs, full-time equivalents, will still be the shortfall by the end of 2020, moving down to 3 million by 2022. In a pessimistic scenario, however, and you will see that rate doubling, worsening by a factor of 2 by 2022. In other words, the low-income countries will still be 6 million full-time equivalents below the no pandemic trend, if you will. Whereas in an optimistic scenario, notably a case in which the world does rally to do some of what the Director General just referred to, which is to provide better equitable access to vaccines and stronger support for developing countries in their fiscal efforts to deal with the hardest hit sectors and groups, the low-income countries will have made up that shortfall by 2022. So you can see from just this one illustration for low-income countries that there's a significant range of uncertainty here, meaning that the future is not foreordained. Through policy effort, both nationally and particularly through international cooperation and support, we can collectively make a difference to help countries, even those who are the poorest, recover in a human-centered and broad-based fashion.
Okay, next up is Mark Engelhardt from the Tagesschau Zeitung. Over to you, please.
Thanks very much. I'd like to come back to the 4 factors you mentioned for human-centered recovery. How hopeful are you really that you will be heard with these factors, and where do you expect the major or the most resistance, rather with the governments, for instance, or with the employer side? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Look, I am hopeful. I am hopeful that the messages that we are putting out in this report about appropriate policy responses to the crisis will indeed be heard. I am encouraged too that the debate taking place in our organization, but not only in our organization, I think is informed by the painful experiences of this pandemic. The pandemic laid bare some of the failings of the past. And I'll give one example. The ILO has been talking for a very long time about the implications of the current level of coverage and the adequacy of the coverage of social protection systems. The simple fact of the matter is that a very big majority of working people in the world do not have anything like adequate social protection. And when a pandemic hits, we live the consequences of that. This is not theory, this is lived reality. And I really believe that this necessarily has captured the attention of policymakers around the world. Now, I know it is sometimes easy to believe that once the immediate intensity of a crisis recedes, previous policy settings tend to come back, to set in again. I believe that the lived experience of this pandemic means that sort of gravitational pull back to the status quo ante will not prevail. Let me give you another reason for that. According to the IMF, I think 16 trillion US dollars have been implemented or announced as measures, invested in such measures to respond to the crisis. None of us, if we were sitting here pre-pandemic, could have imagined such expenditure taking place, or even imagined what circumstances would allow or enable such resources to be mobilized. I think we were being told it was impossible. And I think this is one of the things this pandemic has brought. It's brought realization that the accepted policy settings, the accepted understanding of what is possible and how we can meet needs, this needs to be reassessed right now. We need a better balanced consideration of needs and possibilities in the world of work and in our societies. I believe there is a strong popular call for such a reassessment, and I do believe that the international community in which the ILO is located and national governments share that type of awareness of the need for change. We'll see how our conference negotiations play out over the next weeks. But I have to say, although there'll be plenty of controversy over specific points, that I see a common determination from governments, from our employer community, and from our organized labor community to have some sort of a reset in this regard. We'll see how it plays out. We'll see how the world moves forward. We understand that finances are in a new situation. We don't neglect the challenges ahead, but I think that the possibilities are equally there, and I'm confident that they will be acted upon. And the ILO, at least, will be doing its very best to move our people in this direction.
Next is Nina Larson from AFP. Nina, over to you.
Thank you for taking my question. I wanted to follow up on that and also ask more about the issue of working poverty. Could you say maybe a bit more about the quality of the jobs that you're seeing coming back with the slow recovery? Are you seeing signs that the the jobs returning or being created are of lesser quality than previously? Are there bad habits that we picked up during this pandemic that you're concerned about may continue going forward? Thank you.
Okay, let me just, Rick, I'm sure will come in and elaborate on what I have to say at least. Yeah, the poverty figures are absolutely dramatic. If you add together the increase in moderate and extreme poverty, the figure is of an increase of 108 million around it. These are people who work, but they and their families remain in poverty. I mean, it's important to make that distinction. And as I've said earlier on, this remarks a dramatic and more than unwelcome reversal of trends in poverty reduction. So we have a poverty problem here arising from the crisis. Now, the broader point about the quality of jobs being created. Well, the first thing to say, and I think we referred to it in our initial introductions, we've seen shifts in jobs from salaried and wage employment into self-employment. Now, on the face of it, that might seem a benign or non-problematic shift, but the reality of self-employment in all of its very many manifestations is it's often a move to, I'm going to call it survival strategy, to make a living when better alternatives disappear. So there is a relationship in which increases in self-employment can be related to a deterioration in job quality, and that is certainly problematic. But I want to make the point not about what we think fatalistically is going to happen to job quality. I want to make the point about what types of policy interventions are needed to do better, to make sure that jobs meet the criteria of what at the ILO we describe as decent jobs, jobs that give a decent standard of living, jobs which are accompanied by social protection, jobs where people's rights are respected and dialogue is engaged upon to deal with problems. Now, I think that the 4 points I've referred to, the need to invest in institutions of work, to regulate work effectively, to ensure the quality of jobs is the way we need to tackle this issue of job quality. And you must not, although it's too frequently done, leave out of the discussion of job quality the whole question of informality. Those 2 billion working people, 61% of the global working population, who work in conditions of informality and have suffered extraordinarily during this COVID crisis, but even absent a crisis, live in situations of the greatest insecurity and precarity. And if there's one place that the world needs to focus upon when it considers, as you rightly say we should, on job quality issues pulling out of this crisis, it's got to be on formalization of informal working patterns. So that's my sort of big picture answer, but Rick might be able to just dig a little deeper in response to your very important question.
Director General, I think you've covered the primary dynamic here, in that we do see a shift of employment, the composition of employment. It's not only in terms of a increased shift or relative weight of self-employed or informal work, which tends to be smaller scale and sometimes can therefore be of lower productivity. But there are other dynamics as well. Micro and small enterprises have been disproportionately affected. Some of the dynamism of our economies comes from smaller firms, so there's certainly some effect in that regard as well. And then there is the report lays out on page 88 a sector by sector analysis of the effects where the loss of working hours has been most highly concentrated. And you will see there that there are some very important sectors that provide good paying jobs, often with the kinds of labor protections and social protections that lead to higher productivity and whatnot, that have been disproportionately affected. We don't yet know, of course, in answer to the thrust of your question, exactly how these sectors, which have been most exposed medically to the disease, will be able to snap back, not only in more advanced countries, but also less advanced countries. So we can't give you a definitive picture at this stage of the game as to exactly what the effect will be overall on quality of jobs. But these are the main dimensions of the different sectoral impacts, large versus small firms. And then, as the Director General said, the nature of the work arrangement. These all have an effect on quality.
Okay, next is John Zarakostas. John, over to you.
Yes, good morning. I was wondering, Rick, if you could elaborate a little bit on what you just touched on the most affected sectors. Your report mentions included in that batch is the hospitality sector and also wholesale and retail trade. And I'm interested how that's playing out in major economies like the United States and a comparison with China, which has had a quicker recovery. What are the prospects there in terms of permanent job losses in these sectors, in these major economies?
Let me just say that the report does not provide country by country, by sector numbers. However, we do provide global and to some extent regional numbers by sector. So for example, the construction industry faced an 8.8 loss vis-a-vis the no pandemic scenario in percentage terms of working hours lost. Manufacturing, very important for higher paying and better protected jobs generally, 7.3. This is in 2020 relative to that no pandemic scenario. These are very striking numbers. Those two sectors, construction and manufacturing, represent two of the four highest affected. But in specific answer to your question about the US and China, we do not have breakdowns by those sectors by country.
Okay, thanks. Just a reminder that today we're also presenting our statistical update on the youth labor market impact of the COVID-19 crisis. And we have our colleague Sukti Dasgupta from the Employment Department ready to answer any questions. Let's move on. Let's go to Jan Herberman. Over to you, Jan.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I'd like to ask you on the COVID crisis and labor standards. Could you please elaborate on the COVID crisis and the labor standards? Is there evidence that certain employers, I don't talk about all employers, but certain employers, use the crisis to loosen or even to ignore well-established labor standards? And will employees face a race to the bottom in this respect? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it is important, as the questioner has done, to be attentive to the respect in exceptional times of basic worker rights, basic worker protections. I think we all understand that at a time when citizens around the world have had to accept restrictions on their individual behavior, their movement, what they can and cannot do, including going to work, we have to understand what the limits to such restrictions are. And you know, in international law, there are very clear notions about the adequacy of what is required of people compared to the conditions prevailing, how long these restrictions should be imposed, etc. Now, we are attentive, and you will understand that our membership are attentive to anything that might have been introduced in times of COVID that would go beyond what would be acceptable in these terms and might indeed perdure after the immediate threat of COVID has responded. Now, my answer here is that I do not believe that we have witnessed a concerted or a deliberate effort to take advantage of the pandemic to impose long-lasting restrictions on workers' rights. What we have seen, and I think it's quite understandable, even if sometimes unfortunate, is some controversies, some disputes, some disagreements about how COVID-19 has been handled at workplaces. So when workers have been required to go back to work, in what conditions. These are natural points of negotiation and consultation, ensuring that conditions prevailing in workplaces are safe, render those workplaces safe. A whole new area, or if not new, at least greatly increased area of concern has been about the conditions under which remote working, home working is undertaken. And we've seen discussion in a number of countries. Our neighbours in France is a good example of where governments have had to sit down with employers and workers and try to hammer out the acceptable parameters within which home working can and should be done. And I suspect we're going to face quite a lot of these issues going forward. But I think these are, and it's why social dialogue is so vitally important in the recovery process, these are arising issues from radically changed circumstances that need to be addressed. I am not of the view that we have seen, if you like, a large-scale change in respect of workers' rights during COVID-19. But I guess that the next year or the next 2 years, a period which is covered by our report, will provide further indications of where we are going in this respect. There's no doubt this COVID crisis is likely to have accelerated change in several regards, and the use of remote working is the most obvious one of those. And again, I repeat, through social dialogue, these are going to have to be addressed, but clearly in conditions in which fundamental rights are respected. I would just add one point to my answer. We are, I'm afraid, faced with a reality, and we'll be reporting numbers on this in the next 10 days. We are in a situation where we will be seeing, I fear, the record of increased forced and child labor in the world over the last 2 years. As a result of the increased vulnerability, the increased poverty that our report gives evidence of, I'm afraid that the long-term trend towards the reduction of child labor and forced labor in the world, and there has been remarkable progress over the last 2 decades. This will, along with the fight against global poverty, have been thrown into reverse. It is extraordinarily important that international action is directed towards resuming the positive trend as we pull out of the crisis.
Next up is Gabriela Sotomayor from Proceso Mexico. Gabriela, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. I actually have some questions. Is it possible to ask? Mr. Ryder, would you say that the impact of the COVID on the world of at work is much greater than the impact that the pandemic has had on health? And then I have another question on, if it's possible, on Mexico, because the people did not receive support to stay at home during the lockdown. And on the other hand, women had big losses of their work because they have to take care of the children, because the children are at home, they are not at school. So it has been devastating for women in the country. And the third question, very quick, is, are health workers getting the support of their governments that they deserve in this crisis? Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Let me have a first go, and then there may be some points that Rick can bring which might have some particular bearing on Mexico in particular. The first question is really one which I don't think we should try to quantify. To say is, has the impact on the world of work been more serious than the impact on health. The fact is that the two are inseparable. We've said from the beginning, the World Health Organization has said from the beginning that this is not a question about choosing between health and work, between life and livelihoods. We have to address the two sides of this equation at the same time, and they are absolutely interlinked. And we've seen in the development of this pandemic that where the virus has got out of control, where the health crisis has been particularly acute, well, the crisis in the world of work has been particularly acute. It goes together. And we cannot measure losses of human lives against loss of production or even of jobs. I take a view, and it's been expressed by others in the international system, that today health policy is economic policy. Beating the pandemic in health terms is what is a precondition for getting the world of work out of the crisis and on the road to recovery. So it's not an either or. It's not a balance of damage. These things go hand in hand. On health workers, it's a great question. Have health workers, care workers received the support from governments that they really deserve to and should have had? Look, I think this pandemic, and it's one of the things I talked earlier on about our reevaluation of established policy settings. I think anybody who's had their eyes open during this pandemic will have seen that there are large sectors of the workforce that we've come to refer to as key or essential workers during the pandemic, whose work and whose place in the world of work does not receive either the recognition or the reward that most of society have now come to realize it merits. So health and care workers is one, 7 out of 10 of whom are women, by the way, to go to your second question. But I would include in that cleaning staff, public transport staff, and many others. So there is going to have to be, in the months and years ahead, I think, a reconsideration of their conditions of employment, their place in the world of work, their contribution to society. And that will play out, I think, in the discussions that we have ahead of us about the future of the care economy. This is something the ILO was talking about even pre-pandemic, that care needs in society are growing exponentially, and we know that the professionalization of the care economy, much of care work is undertaken entirely unpaid by women, of course. This has to be a focal point of the Building Back Better process. Now on Mexico, and I don't think Mexico would stand out as an exception when you say, Gabriela, that many workers required to stay at home didn't receive the support in financial terms, I guess, that they needed. This has been, I mean, you said it extremely well, this has been the drama of the informal economy. I repeat, those 61% of the global working population who, if, one day to the next, as happened in some countries, were told you cannot go out to work, even if your workplace is a street. You have to stay at home for health reasons, but are outside the coverage of any type of social protection, then you have an impossible situation. Then you have an absolutely impossible situation. Now, we have seen the world introduce on an unprecedented scale ad hoc measures of social protection, income support, whatever it might be. These have been ad hoc. It's been covering a very large number of workers. It's involved a very high level of expenditure. But if, once the pandemic recedes, if those measures are removed, then we're back to where we started. And the next time a crisis strikes, these people will be in similar circumstances. And I think we would all conclude from this crisis that that is a far from acceptable situation. Rick, would you have anything to add?
Maybe just one or two numbers on the premise of your question is correct. But again, our report tends to take more of a regional perspective and a global perspective as opposed to a country-specific perspective. But let me give you some regional perspective that's relevant to Mexico. By contrast to that region's previous labor market adjustment patterns, most of those who lost their jobs in 2020 exited the labor force. Instead of transitioning to unemployment or to informal employment. And women, as you suggest, have borne the major brunt of that unusual trend as compared to previous economic crises. Let me give you one or two numbers in that regard. Women experienced in that region a steeper decline in employment, namely about 11.6%, compared with 8% for men. A much more significant drop in their participation in the labor force. Out of net job losses in Latin America and the Caribbean of nearly 14 million for women, 12.2 million of them, 88%, exited the labor force, probably and often for the reasons you suggested in your question. By the way, that is mirrored on average around the world. Similarly, women have been far more likely to leave the labor force because of care obligations and otherwise than men. So this is some of what we are referring to here as the need for a conscious, a deliberate, broad-based and human-centered strategy affecting those, including women, who have been disproportionately affected by the crisis.
Okay, let me ask Stéphane Boussard from Le Temps to come in now, please.
Yes, thank you very much for. I have a question. Yes, has actually COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 on the job market, been exacerbated by the ongoing digitalization of the job market? In other words, is the combination of digitalization of the job market and the impact of COVID-19, is it particularly nefarious for workers? Thank you.
Well, the whole question of digital transition, digitalization of work, of course, was underway and it was being considered in advance of the pandemic. I think the question is, well, what has the pandemic done to affect this process of transition? Well, the first thing to say is, I mean, probably the one phenomenon in the world of work which is most commented upon during this pandemic is this migration to home working using digital technologies, facilitated by digital technologies. This seems to be the question, it's probably the most frequently asked question about the impact of COVID-19 on the world of work. Would it be permanent or will we revert to where we were previously? And I think you need to put that debate into some perspective. We've estimated that the proportion of jobs in the world which are susceptible to be done remotely through digital technology use is about 18%, 18%. It's not most people's possibility to be able to transfer to this type of work. So this is the difference between adaptation and resilience. The great majority of workers just have to carry on doing their job with pretty much the way they used to do it and taking all of the health precautions that they can. This transfer to digitalized remote work is for a minority, 18% globally, going up to maybe 35, 40% in the most advanced countries. And that's the second part of the story. That is to say that the capacity for digitalization, self-evidently, is dependent upon connectivity. And this is where the digital divide, I think, has not only conditioned the way the world has adapted to the pandemic, but it's also a strong pointer to where we're going in the future. And it's, again, one area where I think we have to worry about the aggravating effects of the crisis on inequalities. Because if we are, and this is a commonly held view, experiencing an acceleration of digitalization of work in the pandemic, and if this is to continue, then clearly some countries are going to be able to catch the train, as it were, of digitalization because they're connected. But a lot of the world is not going to be able to do it. So if you add that factor to the unequal access to vaccines, the unequal access to resources, you've got a danger of two trajectories building up here. And that, I think, is something which should concern us. But I also want to, and I'll finish with this, say that, we really should not treat the way in which digitalization, the move to remote working might have long-term effects on the future of work as a fatality. It's not the technologies or even the availability of technologies which is going to decide. We have societal choices to make about how we use technologies. Now, I haven't taken a poll of the 3,000 people who work for the International Labour Organization to ask them, would they prefer to stay at home and work from home, or do they want to come to the office every day? But it's a discussion worth having, because I'm not sure that any of us really know what the societal answer to these questions are. They are debates which are out there. They are choices, and I want to underline the word choices, that we have to make. And it's up for each one of us to decide what we think would be the best dispensation in the future in terms of digitalization. Is it a hybrid dispensation? Is it a much more a solution which is much more leaning towards remote working on a permanent basis, or do people just simply want to come back to the office and pick up pretty much where they lay? I don't know the answers to those questions. In fact, it's not for me to give the answers to those questions. It's for people to express themselves and for societies to work out the preferences that emerge from such discussion.
Okay, thank you. I see it's almost the hour, so I see there are three follow-up questions from Laurent, John, and Gabriela. So in the interest of time, I'll ask the three of them to come in one after the other, and we'll take those three questions at the same time, and then I'll ask the Director General and Rick to provide the answers. So first, let's go to Laurent.
Yeah, thanks. That's a follow-up question on public support, because there are also some countries where huge recovery packages were approved. And now certain employers, small employers in certain economic activities are complaining because it seems that the extent of the support is delaying the willingness of some people that lost the job or lost working hours to come back to work. And that has also impact on the way some companies, small companies are working. So that delay of people coming back to the work market, how problematic is that?
Okay, thank you. John, your question, please.
Can you hear me there?
Yep.
Oh, good. Yes, I have a follow-up for Rick. If he has, since you didn't have the data for US or China, if he has the regional and global outlook, especially for the wholesale and retail sector. And for Guy, I was wondering if seafarers are also in that priority list. You neglected to mention them, and I was wondering if that's still a priority area for you.
Thank you, John. Next, Gabriela, your follow-up question, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for taking my question again. Well, I didn't want to ask the question the way I did, but I will try another way. So ILO is giving a lot of recommendation, but in your view, Mr. Ryder, what is the vaccine against the impact of COVID-19 in the world of work? Thank you.
Okay, let me have a go at those three questions, and Rick will, I'm sure, look up the figures there for the wholesale and retail sector if you're able to. Look, this hesitancy to return to work, is this, A, does it exist? And then what is it attributable to? Well, I mean, you hear anecdotally arguments that levels of protection being offered in the world of work are a disincentive to people to come back. I mean, I've heard this in certain countries and in certain circumstances. I am not in the least convinced that this is a genuine or serious obstacle. Clearly, measures which have been introduced, and some of them have been remarkable in their volume and their coverage, are designed to tide people over, the temporary emergency we are in, and they will, of course, be withdrawn. I think the danger is more that under pressure of public financial constraints, they will be withdrawn prematurely rather than too late. But I don't think that this is where the main obstacle to a return to work lies. I do think that there is a bit of a hesitancy which arises much more, and I think all of us can understand the psychology behind it. There is a, after people have been away from their workplaces for in excess of a year, firstly, is it safe to go back? Is everything in place that will enable me to return to work in conditions of safety? And then, and this is perhaps somewhat more intangible, I think people who are stressed by being isolated on their own at home are also quite stressed by the idea of returning to a collective workplace. This is not a small thing. So there are elements of hesitancy, but I think they're much more on the medical side of the story than they are on the financial or the protective side of the story. I didn't mention seafarers in the same breath as key or essential workers. That list I did mention, they're slightly different. They're slightly different. The drama of seafarers during this pandemic is that many of them have been stuck on vessels for prolonged periods because crew changes could not take place because of the restrictions on movement and crew replacement that have been put in place because people are trying to stop transmission of the virus. We've had a dramatic situation in the maritime sector during the pandemic. We've worked hard with others in the international system and in the industry to relieve that situation. I think that figure of 400,000 people stranded on board ships at the worst of the pandemic has come down considerably. But in the general course of events, uniquely, for example, the minimum wages of seafarers are covered by global collective agreement. And there's no other situation in the world where that is the case. That offers very important basic protections to seafarers. And I'm pleased to say that that minimum wage is negotiated in this building by ship owners and seafarers representatives. So it's a different case. There are many issues around seafarers that need to be looked at. We have a Maritime Labour Convention that covers it, but I put them in a slightly different box. Is there a vaccine against the effects of COVID in the world of work? No. If there was a vaccine, we could all sort of go and get it and close down the ILO. We'd be in good shape. Vaccines don't exist in this area of work. What you do have, and excuse me, the resort to self-promotion is you do have a place where governments, employers and workers of all countries can come together in this process of dialogue, which I continue to insist on the importance upon, and work out practical solutions to issues that arise. And that's what this organization has been doing for 100 years. It's not a vaccine that solved all the problems of the world of work like that in a flash, but we keep working at it, and it makes the world of work a better place. So it's an ongoing. I wish there were a vaccine, but I don't think there really is. Rick, did you want to pick up the other questions?
And whereas we provide sectoral breakdowns for 2020, the impact on the world of work in these various sectors, as I referenced earlier, we do not, in answer to your question, provide projections or outlooks by sector.
Okay, thanks a lot. We're coming to the end of the press conference. If you have any further questions that you would like to put to the ILO, please get in touch with us at newsroom@ilo.org. Also, since the DG alluded to this, just to let you know that on June 9th at 5:30, we'll be holding a press conference to launch the new global estimates on child labor. This is a joint ILO UNICEF report. It'll be the first global update of the figures since 2017. And as you might know, this is the International Year on the Elimination of Child Labor. So we'll be sending you the information in due time, and Rosalind will announce this at the Palais on Friday. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for taking the time to join this press conference. Be in touch if you have further questions, and we'll be in touch soon. Until then, be safe and take care. Bye-bye.